Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to Biomass Canada Cluster webinar series. My name is Mahmoud Abadian. I'm a research associate at the University of British Columbia working on biomass, bioenergy, and biofuel supply chain and logistics. And I will be moderating this session. Today, we have the fifth webinar from the webinar series. We already had 4 webinars, and probably you attend some of these webinars. You can find information, both the presentation slide and also the recording of the past webinars at Biomass Canada website. If you go to the webinar page, you can find information on the past webinars. Also, we have, in addition to today's webinar, we have 4 webinars in March. So you still can register for these webinars. If you go to the webinar page, you can find the registration link. And if you are interested in these webinars, you still can attend these future webinars. So as I mentioned, that this webinar series is about de-risking and commoditizing underutilized biomass resources in order to facilitate the evolving Canadian bioeconomy. And Biomass Canada cluster has 10 activities or 10 projects. And as I mentioned, we already have 4 of the projects presented in the previous webinars. And today we have another activities that is mainly focusing on purpose-grown crops or dedicated biomass or bioenergy crops and the opportunity in Canada to produce them and increase their yield. Just a quick background on Biomass Canada cluster. So it's a network of 10 projects and activities led by BiofuelNet Canada network and with the financial support from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Agri-Science program, and also with the contribution from industry partners. I should also mention that the focus of the Canada cluster is on enhancing the contribution of Canadian agriculture into the growing Canadian bioeconomy. And these 10 activities are focusing on producing,
camera's on,
processing,
yeah.
and
but I can turn it off. But just no, I will. No, but I'll turn it off.
Don, can you please mute yourself, please? Okay, sorry. So that's the focus of the Biomass Canada cluster, and just a few housekeeping items. So this webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording and the slide will be posted on Biomass Canada website. As you see, we have 2 boxes. One of them is Q&A box. So if you have any question, please type your question in this box, and then we answer as many of these questions we can with the limited time we have. And also, if you type your name and affiliation in the chat box, I guess that's give opportunity to get to know each other in this platform. So before I introduce the speakers, I just want to mention that a group of graduate students at McGill University, they are actually working on a survey to understand the biomass production and utilization and its environmental, economic, and social impact on Canadian society. So they are asking for participation from different groups in Canada and the stakeholders, including farmers and producers, biomass-related industry and businesses and researchers, and also policymakers and legislators. So if you are part of one of these stakeholders, and if you are interested to participate in this survey, please contact Mohammed Antar. You can find his email here. And I'm sure the students appreciate your time and insight to help them to complete this survey. Okay, so with that, I'd like to introduce a speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kevin Vesey and also Dr. Yusuf Papadopoulos. So Dr. Kevin Vesey is a professor of plant biology at St. Mary's University in Halifax. His research area is plant physiology, particularly the functional interaction between crop plants and beneficial microorganisms, and optimizing of crops as biofuel feedstock. He received his PhD from Queen's University, Kingston, and was a professor at the University of Manitoba from 1989 to 2004. And from 2005 to 2017, Kevin served in the position of Dean of Graduate Studies and Associate VP Research at St. Mary's. He has published over 85 peer-reviewed scholarly articles and book chapters, and also he has co-edited one book and been awarded 2 patents. So he's going to have the first presentation, and the second presentation will be given by Yusuf Papadopoulos. Yusuf is a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and adjunct professor at Dalhousie University and St. Mary University. He investigates the role of forage and perennial bioenergy species and their varieties in modern cropping system to improve the performance of ruminant livestock and novel crops for Canada's clean bioenergy products development, while addressing environmental issues. His field of expertise are crop science, plant breeding, agronomy, and quantitative genetics. And his research focus are utilizing breeding strategies to expand the adaptation of forage crops and perennial bioenergy species to abiotic stresses, improving long-term persistence of forage crops and perennial bioenergy species, improving forage legume persistence under grazing, reduce nitrogen fertilizer requirement, increase efficiency of nitrogen transfer from legumes to grasses, and reduce nutrient leaching during the extended growing season, increasing pasture biodiversity, and developing forest cultivars for novel applications. So I'm sure we are going to hear a great presentation from Kevin and Yusuf. And Kevin, please take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Mahmoud. And thank you everybody for joining. Let me share my screen here. Go to the first slide. And there we are. So yes, as Mahmoud indicated, we're studying purpose-grown biomass crops, specifically the efficient production yield modeling and real-world verification. I will give about a 30-minute talk. Specifically, this is Project 6 in the Biomass Canada cluster. And then my colleague, Dr. Papadopoulos, will give about a 10-minute presentation after mine, specifically looking at aspects of evaluating genotypes of biomass grasses. So in these presentations, we always start out with our acknowledgements. So of course, the major funding through the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, the Government of Canada, through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, of course, BiofuelNet Canada, who is the biomass cluster holder. And specifically on this project, Project 6, we have contributions and collaboration and time by many members and staff of the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture, the Nova Scotia Innovation Hub, Port Hawkesbury Paper, and I see Alan's here. Hey, Alan. Acadian Seed Plants, at Eco Bioresources Inc., and of course, St. Mary's University, where I'm located. So the goals of this project, there's 4 of them really. And so this research will determine the yield potential of 4 biomass crops, purpose-grown biomass crops on marginal lands in Nova Scotia. So those crops are, get my cursor working here, 2 grass crops, switchgrass and miscanthus, and 2 tree species, willow and hybrid poplar. But as you can see, the trees are not grown as trees per se with big thick stems in a forest-like environment, but actually it's coppiced trees. So for those of you who are not familiar with coppicing, what you do is you plant a cutting, and at the end of the first year, the establishment year, you cut that cutting right back to a few inches within the soil surface, and that stimulates many, many stems, and the plants are planted very closely together. And so after 3 years, something like hybrid poplar looks like this, lots of biomass there. So this actually yields more biomass than growing them as trees. And this is what you can see in coppiced willow. So as I said, this is on marginal land. We'll talk about what that is and why it is in a moment here. We're also attempting to identify locally sourced biological inputs to enhance the growth of these crops. The reason we're doing locally sourced biological inputs is because the margins, the profit margins on these crops are very narrow. So you try to decrease the input costs as much as possible. Now we're growing these on marginal agricultural lands that sometimes are not the best soils and land for producing crops. So we found some relatively inexpensive, locally sourced biological inputs to hopefully we'll find out if they enhance the growth of these crops. We're going to demonstrate the suitability of these crops in different agricultural areas within Nova Scotia. So apologies to everybody. This is a very Nova Scotia centric presentation, but hopefully it can almost act like a case study for this kind of work or research or actually application that could go on in other parts of the country. And then our final step is to also create mathematical models to predict the yields of these crops under Nova Scotian conditions. So we'll talk about all those things today. So first of all, why when people think of biomass in Canada and even here in Nova Scotia, people usually think of woody biomass, forestry, forest byproducts. And so why purpose-grown biomass crops? Well, in the Nova Scotian context for sure, there are many uncertainties associated with the supply of woody biomass. And the bullet points there indicate some of these. I'm not going to go into each of these in detail. I borrowed this slide from a colleague, Paul Richards at Innovacor. And so there's a number of issues with a secure secure supply chain of woody biomass that could go into biofuel and bioproducts, especially at a cost that would make it feasible. And this last bullet point here, the lack of data on alternative biomass sources, the province was looking at this a few years ago and realized that in terms of things like purpose-grown biomass crops, there wasn't a lot of data out there, which was one of the stimulators for this study. Now, despite the fact that we have a problem with supply, a consistent supply of woody biomass in Nova Scotia, there is actually some advantages when you look at purpose-grown biomass crops. And I say Nova Scotia has abundance in italics like that, quotation marks, of underutilized marginal land. And you know, it's a blessing and it's a curse. We have quite a bit of land that is of poor agricultural quality, and a lot of it that's been actually abandoned. So for those of you familiar with the classification system of agricultural lands in Canada, it goes from class 1, which is the best kind of land, through to about class 7. And in Nova Scotia, we have a lot of rocks and we have a lot of trees, but we do have agricultural lands, as this map shows. But you can see there's virtually no class 1. There's very limited class 2, and then class 3 and class 4 tends to be the majority of agricultural lands. And these sorts of crops can grow well on class 3, even class 4. And we have over 400,000 hectares of class 4 land in the province, which is basically, I use the term underutilized, because either it's being used for poor quality forage, poor quality pasture, or like I say, even just abandoned and going back to weeds and alders. So you couldn't do this in Southern Ontario. My understanding is just the value of agricultural land is too much because again, there's narrow profit margins on these, but we may have advantage on this and in other locations in Canada that have these sorts of circumstances. And what are some advantages of purpose-grown biomass crops, particularly vis-a-vis looking at what we call first-generation biomass crops? So the first-generation biomass crops being essentially food crops like wheat, canola, corn, where you basically divert some of these things that could be going into food into bioproducts or biofuels. The purpose-grown biomass crops are only grown for their biomass, basically the lignocellulosic content in the plant. They are not food. We can grow these on margin agricultural land, largely lands not good enough for growing food. And so you really avoid the food versus fuel or food versus bioproduct debate, which is a huge advantage for these. They are perennial crops. So once we do get them established, the crops can be harvested, the grasses for up to 15 years and the trees for up to 30 years before you really need to rotate the land into another type of crop. Even in environments, climates like ours, they're high yielding in the range of 12 to 18 dry tons per hectare per year, with, very importantly, little to no inputs in terms of fertilizers, pesticides, etc. So again, the idea of keeping those inputs low are both an economic necessity for these crops with low profit margins, but also that it's makes them more sustainable. I mean, we're producing these crops to try and decrease greenhouse gas emissions by using biomass rather than petroleum-based fuels or bioproducts based upon petroleum. And fertilizer, of course, especially nitrogen fertilizer, contributes greatly to greenhouse gas emissions, both in its production and its use. So a big advantage of these crops, you can grow them on relatively poor land, high yields with small inputs. And not only are we hopefully producing biomass to offset petroleum, these crops actually increase the carbon or organic matter content of the soils in which they grow. They are perennial. They are adding carbon to the soil. Some of that is going into the long-term humic fraction. So you're really sequestering this carbon for long-term. So you're both offsetting petroleum, but even sequestering carbon in the soil as well. And so if these crops are so great, how come everybody's not growing them? Well, that's the chicken and the egg story, or the chicken and the egg problem, as I put it. So for example, a farmer, an agriculture producer says to me, I'm not going to grow these crops unless I have a market for the biomass, you know. So even though I might have the marginal land, invest my time, possibly new machinery, the learning curve, why would I do that? It just doesn't make any sense unless I know I've got a market for the biomass I'm going to produce. And the other, whether it's the chicken or the egg, on the other side of the story is the biorefiner or the investor who wants to utilize this biomass. And they say, I'm not going to invest in a biorefinery, some sort of plant to enhance this, to use this biomass, unless I'm sure I've got a secure supply chain of biomass to my plant's gate. And that biomass has to be at the right price. It's got to be at the right quality, and it has to be at the right volume. And long-term, often they're looking for contracts that are in the decades, not in the years, to justify the investment in these processing plants, which are often in the tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. So this is the chicken and the egg story. So our work is hopefully going to de-risk these financial risks for both the producer and the biorefiner or investor to know what is just the yield potential, and what are some of the, can these crops grow? Can they be grown economically in climates and soil types like Nova Scotia? Pardon me. So we've got two approaches, as I said at the outset, two approaches in this, one field studies and one a modeling approach. So the field studies, as I said, we're testing with these 4 biomass crops. We're testing them at 7 locations across the province with 3 biological inputs, these low cost, locally sourced inputs, things like pulp mill residue, anaerobic digestate, and a seaweed extract. I'll talk about that in a moment, what those things are. And so we're monitoring these sites. So the first ones went in 2019, and we're monitoring them until 2023. So for you agronomy geeks out there, this is the design of our experiment at each site. It's a randomized complete block design. So each one of these is a block 1, 2, 3, and 4, each block being a replicate. In each block, we have each of the crops: switchgrass, poplar, willow, and miscanthus. And then subplots within each crop is our soil amendments and control, or we call them biofertilizers 1 through 3. Okay, so that's the layout of our field studies. As I said, we've got 7 sites. 5 were established in 2019, so the red spots here, 2 in Cape Breton. These are both at farmer collaborator sites. 1 here at the Agriculture and Agri-Food Research Center farm in Nepan, Nova Scotia. Here is at the Dalhousie University Faculty of Agriculture facility in Bible Hill. I've got trouble seeing my cursor here. This one again at a farmer collaborator in East Gore. So those were all installed in 2019. We're supposed to put in 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 sites in 2020, but this little thing called COVID-19 got in the way. So we have had to reduce to just 2 sites that we will be putting in this year, 1 in Falmouth and 1 down here close to Yarmouth in the tropics of Nova Scotia, about as far south as you can get. And yeah, so we pretty well cover the province, and that's where the sites are located. So very different climates, very different, not climates, but very different meteorological conditions, different soil conditions. So we've covered the province pretty well. So we establish these crops at these sites. What do we measure? Well, we do mid-season measurements, all the sorts of things you measure in measuring plant growth in the field. And also note that we do soil sampling from each treatment. So we want to see the effects of both these crops and our soil amendments, our biological inputs on the soil. At the end of season, we do survival rate again. We do dry weight, we do plant height, and the dry weight, we harvest the grasses every year, but the trees, as I mentioned earlier, you only harvest those once every 3 years. So in the alternative years, in the trees, we measure stem number, diameter, and height as a proxy for biomass. We also are using miscanthus as our sort of indicator species. We harvest the miscanthus, one of the grass crops, and analyze it for nutrient content to see the effect of both our soil amendments and site characteristics on the nutritional makeup of the plants. And we measure lots of meteorological data, both on site and from Environment Canada stations nearest to the sites. Okay, so progress to date in our field studies. Here's some of the field crew. This is my long-suffering research associate, Dr. Human Fei. He's got the field plan there in his hand. And this is Emily, a PhD student working on the project. This is Cameron, a master's student, and we have a great array of other students that we bring in as help. And this is at one of the sites in Cape Breton. That's a big vat of digestate. Anaerobic digestate that they're going to be applying. It's very messy. That's why they're all in the biohazard. They're not really biohazard suits, but in the coveralls. And so just to talk about these inputs a little bit, and even some of the results that we're seeing from them. The picture at the bottom there is from our part of our site at the Nepan research farm, AFC's research farm in Nepan. And we're looking at in the foreground there. Come on, cursor, where are you? There we are. In the foreground here, this is one of our miscanthus plots, and you can see the control plot here. This is only about 6 weeks into growing this crop, and the control crop, you can see there it is, and we're already having effect of our pulp mill wood fiber residue, AKA pulp sludge. So sometimes you'll see it abbreviated as PS for pulp sludge. So that's what this is. It's a byproduct from a paper making process, fine bits of fiber, short fibers. And so we incorporate that into the soil just before planting at a rate of 12 tons per hectare. And I think you can see even visually here, just 6 weeks into the experiment, we're starting to see some effects compared to control. The liquid digestate, so of course anaerobic digestion is a way to convert biomass into specifically mainly biogas. And there's a number of byproducts from that, a solid digestate and a liquid digestate, which is really this lovely, rich, thick, organic, kind of smelly, slurry sort of stuff, which is just full of carbon and nutrients. and like I say, is a byproduct of anaerobic digestion. So we have one of our farmers who has an anaerobic digester donating this as an input. We put that in at about 15,000 liters per hectare equivalent. And the final one input we have here is a seaweed extract by Acadian seed plants. I have worked with this seaweed extract in many crops, food crops, it's lots of, you put it on a very low concentrations. It's almost working at the plant hormone level, and found it stimulates the growth of all kinds of different crops. So I was very curious as to see it would also work on these purpose-grown biomass crops. So that's the layout, and you can see here even just this is the same year's establishment, just 6 weeks in, you can start to see some effects of these amendments compared to the control. So that was very exciting. Usually you can't see these visually that early, so that was very hopeful. And this is the only quantitative data I'm going to show you. Some of you will be disappointed by that. Some of you will be relieved by this. But what we're looking at here is, again, a measure of growth at Nepan, again, in the establishment year, 2019. And this is just a dry weight per sample. So it's not per hectare or anything. We haven't done that conversion on this slide. And we're looking at two of the crops. One of the grasses, miscanthus, and the other one, the willow. And here's our four soil amendment, or our control, and then our soil, the digestate, the pulp mill fiber, and the seaweed extract. And you can definitely see an effect of the pulp sludge in both the grasses and the willow, significantly so. It's really wild, because this is just basically pure carbon fiber, very low on any other nutrients. But particularly on these, some of these are pretty poor soils, not so much in Nepan, but some of them pretty poor soils. And so there's all kinds of wonderful things happening by that input of carbon at these sites. And this is quite consistent across our sites and going into our second year of study as well. So what I'd like to do now is just have a few slides that are very unscientific, not nice graphs, but almost anecdotal or observational, but the kind of information that farmers in particular are really looking for. So some lessons we've learned about establishing these crops in Nova Scotia. And, you know, again, it's kind of like, if we knew then what we know now, we probably would have gone about this a lot better. And some weird ones that you would not think of, like these little critters. So one of our, well, several of our sites have a deer population around them. There's lots of deer in Nova Scotia. But at this site in Bible Hill, the deer are incredibly brazen. I mean, they'll almost walk right up to you. So they are very habituated to humans. They're not scared of us. There's no hunting goes on in this area. I think if they were hunted each fall, they'd be much more wary of humans. And they love chewing on the trees, on the leaves, the new growth from the trees. So it came to a point that in our second year, we had to put up this deer fence to protect the site. The site's only about 1 acre, but we had to do that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had any tree crops. Now, this is not a practical solution for farmers. So what this really tells you is if a farmer is looking to grow some biomass crops in these ways, and they have a heavy deer population, and the deer are very brave or brazen, you're probably better going to the grasses. They don't really like the grasses. They're not a problem for the grasses, but they will virtually eat the trees right out of your site. We've also discovered, we knew this beforehand, people warned us that weed control is extremely important in the first couple of years until the canopies start to close. And we could manage it mechanically on almost all of the crops except the switchgrass. The switchgrass, we just couldn't keep up with particularly the broadleaf weeds at all the sites, in fact. So after consulting with Yusuf, who's been growing switchgrass for decades, he recommended that we do use a herbicide. So we went in with a herbicide spray in year 2 that we would rather avoid just because of the cost. But it was necessary. That really knocked the broadleaves back, and hopefully the canopies, the switchgrass will do fine going forward. This is a weird one. So we have one site with very, very heavy soils. And so we established them in 2019. in the spring of 2020, we go out to the site and we find things like this. So this is the cutting, the original cutting. But the original cutting, this was the original planting height. So this thing was down here when we planted it. And by the end of the first winter, it has from frost heaving been pushed out of the soil that much. In fact, sometimes it's pushed right out of the soil and we find the cutting lying on the surface of the soil. Of course, the cutting dies. This one might have a little bit of growth here. It might be surviving a bit, but all of the stems from last year are dead. And so this really knocks back the growth of the plant if it survives at all. So again, if you've got a very heavy soil, you're probably best not going with the trees and going with the grass species. And then I gotta say, for me, in particular, for me personally, the biggest surprise I've had out of this is the miscanthus. Okay, so miscanthus is a C4 crop originally from Southeast Asia, I think its origin. A tropical in origin. We're about at the northern limit for miscanthus. And people have grown miscanthus in Nova Scotia before. And it grows well, it can grow fine. It's getting it established. And we have not had that problem. We have 100% establishment, and particularly, very importantly, 100% overwintering survival rate. So that first winter it survived that very well. So here is Dr. Fay. This is at one of our sites in Cape Breton. And this is just mid-August. So this was planted the previous year, went dormant, regrew, and incredible biomass. So by the end of the season, this was at 10 ton per hectare, which is quite incredible for just the second year of growth. So we're very excited about miscanthus. So why is miscanthus working so well for us when in previous attempts, like I say, it'll grow fine, it's getting established. And so the reason being, we believe, is that this is a sterile hybrid of miscanthus giganteus, and it's normally grown, planted from rhizomes because it's vegetative. We tried growing in a previous study miscanthus, and we got the same problems that everybody else seemed to have in Nova Scotia, is that those rhizomes, if you got 50% plants emerging from those rhizomes, you were lucky. And then the first winter was very hard on those plants that were struggling to get established. We, like I said, 100% establishment, 100% over wintering survival in the first winter. Why? Because Dr. Fay is a tissue culture wizard, I call him. And so he said to me, Kevin, let's go with a plantlet, tissue culture plantlet approach instead of the rhizomes. So we produce these in our lab, tissue culture from growing points on the plants, and we can reproduce them in mass from the culture vessel. They go into the greenhouse, are grown up in the greenhouse a bit, and then we plant the plantlets into the soil and get this really quick. And so this is just literally weeks later. It's a great establishment. Now, of course, this is more expensive. Rhizomes aren't cheap either. We haven't done the economics yet, but we hope that it will be competitive, particularly because you get this incredible growth so quickly. Okay, so the other part of the project is on yield modeling. And so why do the yield modeling? Okay, we're out there doing our field studies, but even with those field studies and the studies that have gone on before, there's still too few studies of purpose-grown biomass crops in Nova Scotia to confidently inform the industry of their potential yield. So while we build up this database of more empirical data, we have taken the theoretical approach of creating mathematical models of their yield potential based upon studies of the growth of these biomass crops in other places in the world with climates comparable to Nova Scotia. So we're looking mainly at northern US, other parts of Canada, and some parts of Europe. So what kind of yields were they getting in places that had at least climate similar to Nova Scotia? And my PhD student, Emily, God bless her, did an incredible amount of work analyzing over 50 soil and meteorological factors from hundreds of light years of data to look at which of the soil and or meteorological factors helped predict the yield that ultimately was seen in those studies. And after crunching an incredible amount of numbers and looking at piles and piles of data, 2 factors: growing degree days, basically accumulated heat through the growing season, and seasonal precipitation were very predictive of, we started out with switchgrass in the modeling process, switchgrass yield. So we could create these models based upon just these 2. All the other ones, and for various reasons, I could talk about that over a beer, why they weren't as predictive. So this is what our model is based upon. So this looks very busy, but what we're looking at here on the left, this is one way you can assess the accuracy of your model. Okay, so on the x-axis here, we have the measured biomass. So each one of these dots represent a site year of data from a study somewhere in the world with a climate similar to Nova Scotia's. And so that's the measured biomass. And then on the y-axis here, this is what the biomass is after it's crunched. The numbers have been crunched in our model. And so what this, it's a nice linear relationship. That's good. It shows that the dots are all scattered around this regression line. These hashed lines are what's called the zone of predictability, and the vast majority of the data sit in that zone of predictability. And very importantly, the gray shaded area is the 95% confidence interval. So we've got a very nice tight 95% confidence interval around this. So this gives us quite a bit of confidence that this model is reasonably accurate. One other thing I want to point to, the black dots are from studies outside of Nova Scotia, and the blue dots are from studies. I said there has been studies, particularly of switchgrass within Nova Scotia, and we're all very relieved to see that the blue dots are all scattered amongst all the black dots. So if all the blue dots were segregated in one area, then it would suggest that maybe this doesn't reflect Nova Scotia conditions that well, but it looks good. And then this little exercise over here is saying that, okay, taking our model, if we took 2 locations in Nova Scotia, Nepan and Kentville, and we looked at the growing degree days and the precipitation each year in 2011 through 2019, what kind of yields of switchgrass might you get? So we run our models and we found that the lowest would be in 2016, down below about 9.7 or so tons per hectare, the highest being 10.4, with an average of across the 2 sites across all those years being 9.9 plus or minus 1 megagram per hectare or ton per hectare. So those are that's it's still theoretical at this point. We need to do a lot more verification to see how accurate the model is in the real world, but it gives you a sense of likely the yield potential of switchgrass according to this modeling. Very quickly, the miscanthus, similar sort of process here. You can see we've got fewer data points because we are really at the northern limit. So finding places where the growing miscanthus successfully under our sorts of climatic conditions, there's a lot fewer studies. But again, the same good zone of predictability. Where's my cursor? I can't see it there. Oops. Zone of predictability here. There it is. A nice regression line, nice tight confidence interval. And I'll just draw your attention, when we did that same sort of exercise of looking at different years and different sites, we came up with 21.3 ton per hectare. That's great. If we can produce that amount of miscanthus here. And like I say, our early studies with miscanthus, at least with well-established miscanthus, I think we'll easily be able to hit that. Okay, so finishing up here, looking at some of the relevance and some of the success outcomes. Again, To repeat, this research will determine the yield potential and hopefully identify best practices for production of these crops in different agricultural areas in Nova Scotia, thereby reducing the financial risk to potential producers and users of these crops. The research may also help to create new revenue streams for agricultural producers from these underutilized marginal lands. The research may help diversify the biomass feedstock base in Nova Scotia to help attract some other biomass processing facilities. And finally, it may create new markets for these three biological inputs that we're looking at. These are low valued, relatively low value, and hopefully we can add some, either some market or some value to these. But there's still some critical success factors. And this first one is the big question: will the yield potential be high enough and the cost of production low enough to convince agricultural producers to grow these crops and to attract more biomass processing facilities to the province? That's the $10 million question. And then the second question I've got here, because we know this from other jurisdictions, the United States, Europe, often growing our bioeconomy requires some policy changes by government, not necessarily subsidies. Subsidies are great, but things to de-risk the situation for both the producer and the people that are going to process it. So with that, just future work. So we're going to continue this work basically through to 2021. This is one of our last sites we're going to put in here. This is the Bay of Maine here. This is near Yarmouth. So that's our southernmost point. And we'll continue to refine our databases and our prediction models as well. So I just want to finish off here before handing it over to Yusuf. A big thanks, especially to these first people here, all of the farmer collaborators. These people are donating their land. They prepare the land for us. They help move heavy things for us because we have very little equipment, virtually no equipment. And we carry everything, all our equipment we carry. And so, I could not do this without the incredible support from these farmer collaborators, and everybody else on that page is important as well. So with that, we ask that you hold off your questions until the end. We'll have Joseph give his presentation, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so I'm seeing what's going on here. So I'm going to, Joseph, you look like the face of God there, Joseph, with the light coming in the window, but I'll mute myself and turn off my video. But I guess I do, you just tell me when you want to the slide to move forward and I'll do that. Okay, Joseph, you are still muted.
Yeah, sorry about I'm working from my basement and I don't choose when the sun shines down here anyway. Well, good afternoon, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to show you some of the findings we have. My main focus is going to be on adapted and productive cultivars for dedicated perennial bioenergy crops in Eastern Canada. But our programs is national, and I'll show you the bigger scope as we go on. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk about is primarily on perennial bioenergy grass species, switchgrass and miscanthus. If you look down on the far left, this is a site where the miscanthus quite high on some of the variety they have in Agassiz, BC. And in the center, you can see, I don't know, probably Bill Thomas is listening to this presentation. This is on-farm site where Bill and I visited, that he was giving recommendation on production. And if you know Bill, he's quite a high guy. When I talk to him, I have to look up to him. So it's quite, like Kevin said, this is a very productive species. And on the right, you can see the switchgrass. This particular slide is from New Brunswick, that I visited a site where they have this forage biomass crop. Okay, next, please. All right, so what I'm going to talk about, just focus with the 10 minutes. I'm going to demonstrate to you, I'm going to concentrate on the switchgrass. I'm going to show you the breeding efforts to develop productive switchgrass cultivars. And then I would like to look at adaptation productivity, both switchgrass and miscanthus. And I'm going to show you some of the current results from the evaluation trials. Okay, Kevin, next, please. Next slide. Yeah, in 2006, Bill Thomas and I and another group of collaborators, we were looking at a potential producing biomass as a complementary crop to our livestock producers. And we had a focus group in 2006, and we brought some key producers that interested in this concept, and also brought industry. We also, part of the industry, we had Nova Scotia Power. So we decided beyond that is to go in and take a look at what can we do. So if we can have the next slide, please. Next slide. Can you hear me, Kevin?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm not sure my thing, my seems to be frozen.
Yeah. Anyway, I'll talk a bit more. In that focus group, the producers and the industry, we were told unless we have 10 tons, around between 9 and 10 tons per hectare, then it's not going to be profitable to really grow that particular, crop for them. Anything less. So Bill Thomas and I decided to look at grasses. Particularly, we grow a lot of forage grass. They're well adapted. And we chose some of the key currently forage species and cultivars, reed canary, tall fescue, and timothy. And also on the left-hand side of the slide, you see then when it was available in 2011, cultivars of switchgrass. So you can take a look, established in 2011, and the white is the 2012 first production year, and the dark one is the second production year. Obviously, our forage grasses to be left till the fall to harvest, they were not as high yielding as some of the switchgrass cultivars, particularly Cave and Rock and Shiwami is really demonstrated they have a very good potential moving toward the goal of getting the yield preferred for producers to make profit under this. And remember, when you establish a grass stand, establishment year actually at least will be 2 years. We talk establishment year when we see that, that's not true. Establishment will take about 2 to 3 years before the stand hitting a good productivity. All right, next, please. All right, well, this trial that I showed you where we continue with the switchgrass, and as you can see, this is to 2020. On the left-hand side, September, and on the right-hand side is the October. This is around the time where we harvest the crops in it. So it looked like a very good stand. It's been sustaining very well. So it's got a lot of promise. Let's look at the next slide, please. Okay, this slide looks a bit more complicated, but it's got a lot of good information. It shows the yield of those different cultivars, switchgrass cultivars, over the years. As you can see, In 2011, 2012, the yield were below 3,000 and then went up quite a range, up a bit to between 2 and 7 or 8 tons per hectare. Now, the profile, as you can see, over the 10 years, it really peaks as the stand gets stronger and stronger. And however, the life of the span of that seeding when we did in 2011, it looks very, it started declining beyond 2019 and 20. That's not actually true for all cultivars. 2020 and 2019, we had droughty weather that really may have affected this yield. But this profile that you see is very similar to what they have in the United States, so on. So the other point I really want to point to is that if you look at there are 2 good cultivars showing still good productivity in the goal. The average over the 9 years of Blackwell and Cave and Rock is between 8.5 to 9 tons per hectare. So that's really good and productive potential for our producer to go in. The other thing is that when I look at this slide, really what we want to do, we want to make sure the establishment productivity in establishment is much higher in yield, and also extend the productivity of the stand beyond 10 years. So we have 1 more year to assess the study, and we'll probably keep it a bit longer. Okay, let's look at the next slide. All right, so the next study, we decided there are newer cultivars coming in, and we tried to look at it nationally instead of just Nova Scotia or Eastern Canada. So the site that Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada project was initiated in Nepean, Nova Scotia, Indian Hill, Saskatchewan, Agassiz, BC, and Lethbridge, Alberta. Next slide, please. Okay, this picture I want to show you. This is on the left-hand side, is that new trial we put in. It looked a bit deceiving because my senior technician, Matthew Krause, took the picture from the top of the hot drop machine. So, but nonetheless, if you look at the stand established 2018 versus the one established in 2011, there is a way to go for from the establishment year where you want to see adequate harvestable material for producers. Okay, next slide, please. All right, this is the average of the foresight productivity. And I broke it here for you, included the different cultivars like Cave and Rock and Blackwell. They're still doing fairly well. But look at the green site. This is Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada have a dedicated breeder, Annie Clausen, Dr. Annie Clausen in Quebec City. And she has been developing a newer cultivars, and you can see her efforts are really taking an extra inch or so on the productivity per se. So it's very promising, but remember, this is only the first production year, and we got the 2020 data because of COVID, got delayed in processing, but we have the data for it. This study will continue it again to see productivity down the road. Okay, next slide, please. All right, what I want to tell you, and Kevin talked about weed control and establishment. This is very, very critical to say that this is a C4 plant that different than adaptation in our region. So establishing it early in the spring is you're just competing with weeds and so on. So this stand, if you look at the left-hand side, that was established in early July, seeded early July. And if you take a look closely, see open where dead material there is. This is the weed control we did. And so obviously we have very good weed control. The center one is the production, the growth of the stand into September. And if you look at the right-hand side, it's a close-up look. We have an excellent looking stand. So I think effective management strategy for growing this particular crop is very, very critical. And we have newer study, this particular picture of a new experiment through clean technology funding that came from Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada. We're not only looking at the productivity, looking at a sustainable way of getting production. Kevin talked about using bioproduct to put into it to really improve it. We're looking at legume because nitrogen is very critical. Also, we're looking at assessing the nitrogen input and also looking at a few other management strategies. Okay, next slide, please. All right, miscanthus, I didn't talk too much about it, and I think this slide really to really show up some of the point that Kevin pointed out. The stand that Kevin showed establishment, it's up on he had 100% establishment by transplanting those plantlets. Well, right now the cultivars we have for miscanthus, there are 4 cultivars and that you can purchase, 2 in Ontario and others from British Columbia. There isn't too many selection or number of cultivars to deal with. If you look at the middle slide, after transplanting, this is the kind of weed we're having competition and the slow growth. And the one on the right, show you the 2+. One, when there is hardly any miscanthus showing, because 2 of the 4 cultivar we see that winter killed after the first winter. So adaptation is very critical, and we have to make sure that now to tell you the 2 cultivars that really survived are from were purchased from the Great Lake in Ontario, and they are one cultivar called Riverside and one Ryers. Also, I want to go back quickly to the stand that I showed you had very good establishment before the slide. That variety that we had, it was Big Rock. It was developed by in REAP Canada. Roger Sampson is so right now we're using this new variety in our system. All right, I think I got what I need to say, Kevin, and I have 20 minutes, 20-second summary. First, switchgrass is a productive and persistent bioenergy species in Canada, and based on the switchgrass evaluation trial in US and Canada, high yielding and winter hardy cultivars are commercially available for northern latitude. And I can't see the bottom pointer in the slide, and my memory is getting weak, so I'll skip that. Kevin, I'm done with this presentation. Thank you all for listening to me.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin and Yusuf, for such an informative and insightful presentation. And I'm sure the knowledge that your project is developing can be transferred to other regions in Canada. They have the same opportunity. So if the attendees are okay, if they can stay on for 10 minutes, we can actually go over the question. We have a couple of good, actually very good questions from attendees. And as usual, we get tough questions from Maria Velish. So Kevin Yusuf, she's asking the proposed clean fuel standards includes land use and biodiversity criteria. Would biomass grown on this marginal land meet these criteria?
I'm not sure if I heard the question because I was getting some echo use of microphone. But it's basically, the answer to that, I do not know. Yeah, the clean fuel standards, I got to admit ignorance on that. You know, I know that the system in the States, that a lot of these purpose grown biomass crops do meet the fuel standards, clean fuel standards in the US. I really haven't looked in the Canadian ones because I think they're still just in the process of coming out. So I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, thanks. So the next question is coming from Shahab Sohansan. So he's asking, what are the potential usage of purpose grown crops?
Good question. Shahab, I'm not surprised hearing that question coming from you. You know, when you, in theory, the thing about the biomass crops, particularly the grasses, they tend to be a little bit higher in ash. So that could be an issue for some applications or some uses. Miscanthus tends to be, I believe, a little bit lower in ash than switchgrass. But in terms of it, you know, I loved your guys' presentation on the pelleting. You know, I would think that pelleting would be the first step, or some sort of processing like that, because once you get it in a pellet form, then everything from straight up combustion to other applications are there. But we are so far, maybe, you know, in BC, you guys are further ahead, but we're just on the baby steps of exploring these sorts of crops on this side of the country. So, you know, who's asking for the biomass right now? I know that the province has suggested that they have suggested that they're going to start heating some of their government buildings with biomass. Now, whether they're going to have to fine tune them for wood chips or wood pellets versus pellets that would come from these sorts of crops, I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks. I guess he has a follow-up question. Shab is also asking, any work is planned on harvesting, field drying rate, and the storage stability of the harvested biomass?
Not from this project. No, that's beyond the scope of this project. I mean, there has been, particularly from Tim from CFS. Tim's last name evades me right now. They have done some work in Atlantic Canada as well, and we don't even have balers for the tree species here, harvesters and balers. The closest one is in Quebec at Laval, I think. So we're still in infancy steps. The real questions of whether this sort of project is, what's the yield? We don't even know what the yield potential is here. So you gotta figure those out before you start. Well, I guess in a perfect world, you'd be looking at the entire supply chain. But no, to answer your question, Shab, that's beyond the scope of this study.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kevin. So the next question is about the yield. So it seems miscanthus has higher yield than switchgrass. How about their energy content, and how do you comment these related to their application?
Okay, so and maybe Joseph has some insights on this, but basically, when it comes to energy content, we will be looking at some basic aspects of energy content with this with our studies. Again, you know, it's basically just lignocellulose. So you know, there's the densification issues that come, especially with the grasses. That's why pelletization would probably be a great way to go. But in terms of energy content, there's nothing to imagine why switchgrass would be higher or lower in energy content than miscanthus. But that's more on just a layperson's guesstimate than anything evidence-based. But again, it's often the ash content, which is a problem when it comes to the grasses. And like I said, miscanthus tends to be, at my understanding, it tends to be a little bit lower, a percentage or two lower on the ash content than switchgrass.
Yusuf, do you want to add?
Yes, I actually, this is a very good question. That's very important. Assessing the quality of the biomass for bioenergy, it's not very simple. You know, we can look at ash, it's very easy, but the combustion of it is a bit more costly to assess. However, the good news is we are collaborating with our AFC colleagues in Saskatoon, and this coming, we have material we harvested for the past 10 years, and we're going to assess it for switchgrass. But also, we have the miscanthus, we've been collecting sample from it. We'll look into it. So that is, we have to wait and see. I don't see, like, I agree with Kevin, there shouldn't be a really huge differences in bioenergy content, but it is very important question. Now, another question earlier that Kevin was talking about, or was asked to Kevin about commercialization. I think right now we have, there is a huge demand for pellets, and a lot of those grasses, we can grow them, and pelleting factories is already available. So I think it should be easier to do the commercialization instead of developing new factories for these things. So pellet is one of the bioenergy possibility, but it can start right away.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. I just want to add to what Yusuf and Kevin mentioned that Drax, the largest user of wood pellet in the world, they have done tests on miscanthus, switchgrass, different types of agriculture biomass, and they have been very happy with miscanthus pelletization because of the low ash content and also energy content. So, but they mentioned that the challenge they have is the secure supply. At the moment, they do not have access to a secure supply of miscanthus in Europe. So that's the main challenge. Not really the quality is the second priority. For now, the supply of purpose grown crop is a challenge in Europe and of course in US and Canada as well. So I want to ask the last question, Kevin and Yusuf, from you. So are you looking at developing any life cycle analysis based on the data you are generating? Because at the end of the day, you want to show that miscanthus, switchgrass, or poplar, they are providing an environmental benefit, especially in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emission. Let me look at the entire life cycle analysis. So I'm just curious if you are using your data for any life cycle analysis study.
No, we'd be happy to make that available to anybody doing LCA. One thing that we are trying to do is coordinate. This was a project led by Innovacore, and how I first got involved with this sort of research, at least aspects of it, is one aspect. They're very interested in the financials more than the LCA is, and obviously LCA and the financials are linked and cross-webbed, but you know, what are the costs? And we took the PAMI model, or I should say colleagues took the PAMI model from out west, and so we took our input, our production data, put it into the PAMI model for looking at costs. And I'd say that work is still under development. That's not directly our work, but from colleagues. The other thing that I do hope to come to fruition, we were also working with the Nova Scotia Community College on a geo mapping exercise, so that in theory, we would take our yield prediction model and somebody could go on a website, point to a location in Nova Scotia, say, okay, I want to put a plant in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. How much switchgrass, how much miscanthus, how much of the tree species, the coppice tree species could I get within a 50 kilometer, 100 kilometer, knowing the land base, knowing the production potential from that land base, And so I hope we can get there. Of course, once we have all those things, doing an LCA analysis would be much easier. But again, this is gut more than science. But the very fact that we are working on poor quality lands, that and the fact that it's well known these crops do add organic matter. I really think if we can get a checkoff for carbon sequestration on agricultural lands, that would be another thing that would add value to these crops. But no, we LCA again is beyond the scope of this study, but love to provide our data to anybody who'd like to take on an LCA on this.
Thank you, Kevin. I mentioned the last question, but we got another question from Maria Velish. And if you're okay, I ask this question and then we wrap up the session. So Maria is asking about the, she's saying that given your connection to several farms with digesters, have these farms tested the addition of grasses to digester feed? I guess she's asking for like using these grasses mainly for biogas and renewable gas production.
Yes, they have. And they, the thing about an anaerobic digester is it's incredibly robust. I mean, you can put almost anything, or my understanding is, and I work with, like I say, I know two of the three anaerobic digesters. Those farms are collaborators on this project, and those operations, it's almost like you can throw anything in there. And now, of course, there are byproducts, and the gas production is very much dependent. But, you know, and again, this is almost a layperson. It's almost like brewing, or like you're putting a recipe together. And so they are in the constant lookout for biomass. And that's why two of the three anaerobic digesters in the province are collaborating on this, because they're saying, oh my goodness, if these purpose-grown biomass crops work, that could be a feedstock for my digesters, which I say they are on the, there are actually another colleague is almost like a biomass broker. He's out looking constantly for biomass for these digesters. So it just speaks to the pent-up demand there is for biomass. Just, you know, we only have 3 digesters in the province, but they're looking for biomass. Imagine, you know, if we got some biofuel and bioproduct, you know, there are small operations here, but something bigger to scale, how much the demand there would be out there. But yes, you can put grass, you can put these grasses as they do. They take just straw, anything. It's almost like you can put the kitchen sink in there and it will get digested.
Yusuf, do you want to add any quick comment before we wrap up?
Yeah, I want to go back to the CLA question. I just want to let you know that my director, Dr. Ranjana Sharma, has providing leadership on clean technology, clean energy development. There's a new project she has been leading with Germany on looking at the CLA, as well as all aspects of what we've been discussing the study. I am involved in it, but a lot of big emphasis, really, the part of the leadership in agriculture and agri-food Canada and Saskatchewan, in Saskatoon. So I think the project will be initiated in 2021.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin, Yusuf, for the great presentation and addressing all of the questions, and also thanks all of the attendees to take times and engage in the discussion. I guess we have been very happy with this webinar and also the previous webinar, all of the engagement and also this good discussion from attendees and also the panelists. And I encourage everyone to attend the future webinar. The next one is actually March 4th, and this is another project on the application of agriculture biomass for bio-based products. So I hope you can attend the next webinar on March 4th. I guess it's 11 to 12 p.m. Eastern time. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and I hope everyone has a safe and warm weekend, and hopefully I see you guys in the next webinar. Take care. Bye.